Hello and welcome back. My name is Rory and this is Fireside Fairytales. If you've never been here before, well, welcome. What we do here is I just am going to read you something to help you go to sleep. Although, being the month of October, that may not be exactly my only goal. We are facing the stories that do maybe the opposite to putting you to sleep. Or maybe very much that's what it is, depending on how you feel about these stories. So what have we done this month then? The month of October, because this is the last week of our series, our 4-week series on old spooky tales. Well, we did Arthur Conan Doyle, who of course is better known for Sherlock Holmes, but actually was a prolific, what they called strange fiction writer, but horror in our modern parlance, horror writer. We looked at, of course, Edgar Allan Poe, and we've looked at maybe a slightly unexpected one, H.G. Wells, who's known as the father of science fiction kind of novels. But again, this was at a time where science fiction and horror crossbred a lot. Like, there wasn't as much distinction. You basically just had journals of strange short stories. Now, that wasn't quite as established. Oh, GS says hello. Hello and happy impending Halloween. Well, hello and happy impending Halloween to you, GS. It is wonderful for anybody who can show up here. So the thing is that every other person we've read, H.G. Wells, Arthur Conan Doyle, and Edgar Allan Poe, are all much older 19th, 18th, 19th century kind of writers, or at least influenced by that era, Victorian kind of thing. Lovecraft, who we're going to read tonight, H.P. Lovecraft, is our youngest in that sense. Lovecraft wrote basically from the 20s, just after World War One, up into the 30s, 40s kind of era. I think the 30s was as long as he wrote. I think his last story was 1935. Lovecraft wrote for journals of strange fiction, keeping in mind that this was a time before television, and largely a time even before much radio or film, though it was around. So a lot of the kind of pulp fiction and nightly creepy stories and stuff came from books. Lovecraft made his trade in that. Lovecraft is our first American. No, Edgar Allan Poe was our first American writer. One of a few American writers. And Lovecraft is by far, I'm going to say two contradictory things. Lovecraft is my personal favorite. He's also the worst writer of all of those. In my opinion, I guess, but I think it's pretty clear. I think probably the best overall writer who can do everything from character, story, plot, theme, prose, all in very good balance with each other, was probably H.G. Wells, if maybe Arthur Conan Doyle. I mean, this is all very subjective. I think Edgar Allan Poe was probably the best prose. His stories had maybe pacing problems and character was a little confusing, but he's a good writer of prose, and that's what he was known for. H.P. Lovecraft isn't really good at any of that. He thinks he is, though, which makes it somehow worse. What Lovecraft is good at is the genuine anxiety that his life was marked by and his world building. I'm sure there are examples that could be drawn up of a writer creating a fully fictional world that was interconnected across stories, not by individual characters, but by the world they occupied. But to my knowledge, Lovecraft was the first one to really do that. at least in English language literature, which is what I've read. And of course, that world is the world of Cthulhu and the Elder Gods and this other realm that to even look upon would drive you mad. Which means that much of his stories aren't as immediately obviously creepy to people. What's creepy about Lovecraft's story is the loneliness of them. They're all very lonely, fearful, anxiety-ridden stories with very little explanation. And I think, and I don't normally do this on the show, but I think if I could postulate to try and frame a little bit for you, Arthur Conan Doyle, Edgar Allan Poe, H.G. Wells, and a bunch of people who didn't read, like Algernon, and Mary Shelley and all of that. They all wrote in a time very dominated by Christian ideas of the world, and so basically you would have horrors that were in defiance of, the majesty of God or something like that. Lovecraft is in a lot of ways a kind of horror of a secular or pagan world, where gods might exist in some sense, but they don't care about you. They're not in opposition to some god that cares about you. They don't have a code of ethics that concerns you. You are nothing to anything in Lovecraft's world. You may as well be smeared off the world as an ant. And that kind of pervasive nihilism of the void is what makes Lovecraft is creepy. Lovecraft inspired most of our modern horror, most notably Stephen King, who followed in his footsteps of setting all the stories in the eastern U.S. cities that he lived in and connecting it to an interconnected universe. And if you didn't know, many of Stephen King's books take place in this sort of loosely connected common universe, especially his early books, based on how Lovecraft did it. So that is who we are talking about tonight, H.P. Lovecraft. Now, if you've, pardon me, never read Lovecraft before, that whole section there was just to give you a bit of a primer on it, because I can't actually give you the most seminal Lovecraft works. And there's two reasons for that. This is the last thing that I'll mention before we go into our stories. The first reason why I can't read you the most important Lovecraft works is they're too long. He wrote basically novellas. Those were the most famous things he wrote. Call of Cthulhu being probably the most famous. Mountains of Madness, which is also about the Cthulhu mythos and all that, and does the most explaining. Shadow over Innsmouth, which is related to the story we're going to read tonight, but the story we're reading tonight is much earlier. These are all 100-page stories, so I can't really read them on this show. We'd be here all night. The second reason, which actually is still going to be a problem with the stories I've chosen, that is that Lovecraft, and I'm sure you've heard it before if you know anything about him, was ridiculously racist. To the extent that his wife and friends at the time were like, Lovecraft, there's notes and stuff about it. Lovecraft, what is your problem? Herbert was his name. What is your problem? He was the kind of person who would have panic attacks and leave the party if Jewish people were there. He was out of his mind about it. And there's not a lot of explanation about why he was so neurotic. But that neurosis is woven into his work, sometimes very explicitly, with slurs. But I think it's there in the themes. He fears the other. He thinks the other is a malice or a distortion that's going to take over everything that he prizes. And I think we'll see that in all his works. And, I'll leave it up to you as a probably an educated adult, how you want to interpret themes of like that, whether it's really just as inseparable from the author as, he obviously had fears about mixed-race children and weird things like that have destroyed people's lives over the years, those kind of fears. Or whether you think it speaks to sort of a different, deeper fear the way most horror does. It's hard for me to say. Now, why is he my favorite? Because I feel like when it comes to horror, there's something about being able to personally relate that makes it more. While I don't relate to any of the fear of the other thing, the void's a creepy thing to me. The idea of the void of space and time. So, that's my little preamble on H.P. Lovecraft. And I will say, in case I lose everybody on this, if you want more stuff that kind of develops on themes and even specific world characters and stuff that are in Lovecraft stories, you should check out Lovecraft Country. It's a book from a few years ago, but it's also been adapted into a TV series that is excellent, but unfortunately on HBO, so it's a little hard to get a hold of. So the first story we're going to read from... music was kind of freaking out there. There we go. We'll just restart it. The first thing we're going to read is Dagon. We're going to read Dagon. This was one of the first short stories published by Lovecraft. It is one of the shortest ones we're reading tonight. It covers most of the themes that I think make up Lovecraft's most famous mythos. Here we go. Oh, by the way, he overwrites like everybody that we've read this month, but he's not as good at it. So be prepared. I am writing this under an appreciable mental strain, since by tonight I shall be no more. Penniless, and at the end of my supply of the drug which alone makes my life endurable. I can bear the torture no longer, and shall cast myself from this garret window into the squalid street below. Do not think from my slavery to morphine that I am a weakling or a degenerate. When you've read these hastily scrawled pages, you may guess, though never fully realize, why it is that I must have forgetfulness or death. It was in one of the most open and least frequented parts of the broad Pacific that the packet of which I was supercargo fell a victim to the German sea raider. The Great War was then at its very beginning, and the ocean forces of the Hun had not completely sunk to their later degradation, so that our vessel was made a legitimate prize, whilst we of her crew were treated with all the fairness and consideration due us as naval prisoners. So liberal indeed was the discipline of our captors that 5 days after we were taken, I managed to escape alone in a small boat with water and provisions for a good length of time. When I finally found myself adrift and free, I had but little idea of my surroundings. Never a competent navigator, I could only guess vaguely by the sun and stars that I was somewhat south of the equator. Of the longitude I knew nothing, and no island or coastline was in sight. The weather kept fair, and for uncounted days I drifted aimlessly beneath the scorching sun, waiting for either some passing ship or to be cast on the shores of some habitable land. But neither ship nor land appeared, and I began to despair in my solitude upon the heaving vastness of unbroken blue. The change happened whilst I slept. Its details I shall never know. For my slumber, though troubled and dream-infested, was continuous. When at last I awaked, It was to discover half sucked into a slimy expanse of hellish black mire, which extended about me in monotonous undulations as far as I could see, and in which my boat lay grounded some distance away. Though one might well imagine that my first sensation would be of wonder at so prodigious and unexpected a transformation of scenery, I was in reality more horrified than astonished. For there was in the air and in the rotting soil a sinister quality which chilled me to the very core. The region was putrid with the carcasses of decaying fish, and of other less describable things which I saw protruding from the nasty mud of the unending plain. Perhaps I should not hope to convey in mere words the unutterable hideousness that can dwell in absolute silence and barren immensity. There was nothing within hearing and nothing in sight save a vast reach of black slime. Yet the very completeness of the stillness and the homogeneity of the landscape oppressed me with a nauseating fear. The sun was blazing down from a sky which seemed to me almost black in its cloudless cruelty, as though reflecting the inky marsh beneath my feet. As I crawled into the stranded boat, I realized that only one theory could explain my position. Through some unprecedented volcanic upheaval, a portion of the ocean floor must have been thrown to the surface, exposing regions which for innumerable millions of years had lain hidden under unfathomable watery depths. So great was the extent of the new land which had risen beneath me that I could not detect the faintest noise of the surging ocean, strain my ears as I might. Nor were there any sea fowl to prey upon the dead things. For several hours I sat thinking, or brooding in the boat, which lay upon its side and afforded a slight shade as the sun moved across the heavens. As the day progressed, the ground lost some of its thickness and seemed likely to dry sufficiently for traveling purposes in a short time. That night I slept but little, and the next day I made for myself a pack containing food and water, preparatory to an overland journey in search of the vanished sea and possible rescue. On the third morning I found the soil dry enough to walk upon with ease. The odor of the fish was maddening, but I was too much concerned with graver things to mind so slight an evil, and set out boldly for an unknown goal. All day I forged steadily westward, guided by a faraway hummock which rose higher than any other elevation on the rolling desert. That night I encamped, and on the following day I still traveled toward the hummock, though that object seemed scarcely nearer than when I had first espied it. By the fourth evening I attained the base of the mound, which turned out to be much higher than it had appeared from a distance. An intervening valley set out in sharper relief from the general surface. Too weary to ascend, I slept in the shadow of the hill. I know not why my dreams were so wild that night. But ere the waning and fantastically gibbous moon had risen far above the eastern plain, I was awake in a cold perspiration, determined to sleep no more. Such visions as I had experienced were too much for me to endure again, and in the glow of the moon I saw how unwise I had been to travel by day. Without the glare of the parching sun, my journey would have cost me less energy. Indeed, I now felt quite able to perform the ascent which had deterred me at sunset. Picking up my pack, I started for the crest of the eminence. I have said that the unbroken monotony of the rolling plain was a source of vague horror to me, but I think my horror was greater when I gained the summit of the mount and looked down the other side into an immeasurable pit or canyon whose black recesses the moon had not yet soared high enough to illuminate. Come on, man. I felt myself on the edge of the world, peering over the rim into a fathomless chaos of eternal night. Through my terror ran curious reminiscences of Paradise Lost and of Satan's hideous climb through the unfashioned realms of darkness. As the moon climbed higher in the sky, I began to see that the slopes of the valley were not quite so perpendicular as I had imagined. Ledges and outcroppings of rock afforded fairly easy footholds for a descent, whilst after a drop of a few hundred feet the declivity became very gradual. Urged on by an impulse which I cannot definitely analyze, I scrambled with difficulty down the rocks and stood on the gentler slope beneath, gazing into the Stygian depths where no light had penetrated. All at once my attention was captured by a vast and singular object on the opposite slope, which rose steeply at about 100 yards ahead of me, an object that gleamed whitely in the newly bestowed rays of the ascending moon. That it was merely a gigantic piece of stone, I soon assured myself. But I was conscious of a distinct impression that its contour and position were not altogether the work of nature. A closer scrutiny filled me with sensations I cannot express, for despite its enormous magnitude, its position in an abyss which had yawned at the bottom of the sea since the world was young, I perceived beyond a doubt that the strange object was a well-shaped monolith, whose massive bulk had known the workmanship and perhaps the worship of living and thinking creatures. Dazed and frightened, yet not without a certain thrill of the scientist's or archaeologist's delight, I examined my surroundings more closely. The moon, now near the zenith, shone weirdly and vividly upon the towering steeps that hemmed in the chasm, and revealed the fact that a far-flung body of water flowed at the bottom, winding out of sight in both directions, and almost lapping my feet as I stood on the slope. Across the chasm, the wavelets washed the base of the cyclopean monolith, on whose surface I could now trace both inscriptions and crude sculptures. The writing was in a system of hieroglyphics unknown to me, and unlike anything I'd ever seen in books, consisting for the most part of conventionalized aquatic symbols, such as fishes, eels, octopi, crustaceans, mollusks, whales, and the like. Several characters obviously represented marine things which are known to the modern world, but whose decomposing forms I had observed on the ocean-risen plain. It was the pictorial carving, however, that did most to hold me spellbound. Plainly visible across the intervening water on the account of their enormous size were an array of bas-reliefs whose subjects would have excited the envy of a Dory. I think that these things were supposed to depict men, at least a certain sort of men, though the creatures were shown disporting like fishes in the waters of some marine grotto, or paying homage to some monolithic shrine which appeared to be under the waves as well. Of their faces and forms I dare not speak in detail, for the mere remembrance makes me grow faint. Grotesque beyond the imagination of a Poe, Edgar Allan Poe, or a Bulwer, they were damnably human in general outline, despite webbed hands and feet, shockingly wide and flabby lips, glassy, bulging eyes, and other features less pleasant to recall. Curiously enough, they seemed to have been chiseled badly out of proportion with their scenic background, for one of the creatures was shown in the act of killing a whale, represented as but little larger than himself. I remarked, as I say, their grotesqueness and strange size, but in a moment decided that they were merely the imaginary gods of some primitive fishing or seafaring tribe, some tribe whose last descendant had perished eras before the first ancestor of the Piltdown or Neanderthal man was born. Awestruck at this unexpected glimpse into a past beyond the conception of the most daring anthropologist, I stood musing while the moon cast queer reflections on the silent channel before me. Then suddenly I saw it. With only a slight churning to mark its rise to the surface, the thing slid into view above the dark waters, vast, Polyphemus-like, and loathsome. It darted like a stupendous monster of nightmares to the monolith, about which it had flung its giant, scaly arms, while it bowed its hideous head and gave vent to certain measured sounds. I think I went mad then. Of my frantic ascent of the slope and cliff, and of my delirious journey back to the stranded boat, I remember little. I believe I sang a great deal and laughed oddly when I was unable to sing. I have distinct recollections of a great storm some time after I reached the boat. At any rate, I know that I heard peals of thunder and other tones which nature utters only in her wildest moods. And when I came out of the shadows, I was in a San Francisco hospital, brought thither by the captain of the American ship which had picked up my boat in mid-ocean. In my delirium I'd said much, but found that my words had been given scant attention. Of any land upheaval in the Pacific, my rescuers knew nothing, nor did I deem it necessary to insist upon a thing which I knew they could not believe. Once I sought out a celebrated ethnologist, and amused him with peculiar questions regarding the ancient Philistine legend of Dagon, the fish god, but soon perceiving that he was hopelessly conventional, I did not press my inquiries. It is at night, especially when the moon is gibbous and waning, that I see the thing. I tried morphine, but the drug has given only transient surcease, and has drawn me into its clutches as a hopeless slave. So now I am to end it all, having written a full account of the information or the contemptuous amusement of my fellow men. Often I ask myself if it could not have all been a pure phantasm, a mere freak of fever as I lay sun-stricken and raving in the open boat after my escape from the German man-of-war. This I ask myself, but ever does there come before me a hideously vivid vision in reply. I cannot think of the deep sea without shuddering at the nameless things that may at this very moment be crawling and floundering on its slimy bed, worshipping their ancient stone idols and carving their own detestable likenesses on submarine obelisks of water-soaked granite. I dream of a day when they may rise above the billows to drag down in their reeking talons the remnants of puny, war-exhausted mankind. Of a day when the lands shall sink and the dark ocean floor shall ascend amidst universal pandemonium. The end is near. I hear a noise at the door as of some immense slippery body lumbering against it. It shall not find me. God, that hand! The window! The window! Whoa! The other thing I didn't mention is that H.P. Lovecraft is kind of really in the style, that's the end, by the way, of the, what would become, I think, sort of the sarcastically melodramatic, fainting, radio show style horror that I think so many of us think of that eventually became kind of the corny films of the 50s. GS says he likes ocean creatures. On the contrary, I think he's terrified of anything deep and dark that he can't see. She also says, yeah, sounds like the Creatures of the Black Lagoon. Yeah, so Creatures of the Black Lagoon, I don't know for this for sure, but I am Pharaoh. GS says, what? What happened? I'll explain, okay. Creatures of the Black Lagoon, I think almost certainly was heavily inspired and taken from maybe Shadow over Innsmouth. If it's not, then Shadow over Innsmouth is taking from it. Like, they're very similar. So what happened? Well, the entire story is a suicide note. And he is recounting his visions of these horrible creatures that burst up from the sea and his unshakable fear that they're going to come and dominate the land and drag humanity to their death. The extinction of humanity is a common theme. And so in the end there, he's saying that he can hear something at his door, and he is certain that it's these fish creatures coming for him, and so he jumps out a window to kill himself, as he had always intended. Why he would write that in his suicide note, don't think about it too much. We're not in, this is not the same level of writing that you might consider. These are sort of a lot cornier. Okay. So where are we at for time? I think we have enough time for the next one I wanted to do, which is also Lovecraft. And then after that, we're going to do something very different, a short story from Mark Twain about a ghost. That is, I think, a good kind of way to end off a month of creepy, morbid things. I think Mark Twain has the right tone for us to wrap up on. Pickman is a longer story. Pickman's model is a longer story. I think this is probably one of my favorites, though I think my actual favorites is either Mountains of Madness, which I think is very, very good. Even for Lovecraft, it's good. And The Horror of Dunwich. Took me a minute there. Okay. So, Pickman's Model. Again, by H.P. Lovecraft. Now, this one was written about 10 years later than Dagon. Just to give you a little bit of context so that you don't feel too confused out the gate, this is one side of a conversation that we never hear the other side of. Also, there is a point in here where he uses a racial slur. I'm just going to tell you it's a racial slur, and I won't read it. If you feel so inclined, it will be up on the screen. But like I said, it is incredibly hard to find anything from this man that doesn't. Pickman's Model from 1926. You needn't think I'm crazy, Elliot. Plenty of others have queerer prejudices than this. Why don't you laugh at Oliver's grandfather, who won't ride in a motor? If I don't like that damn subway, it's my own business. And we got here more quickly anyhow in the taxi. We'd have to walk up the hill from Park Street if we'd taken the car. I know I'm more nervous than I was when you saw me last year, but you needn't hold a clinic over it. There's plenty of reason, God knows, and I'm lucky to be sane at all. Why the third degree? You didn't used to be so inquisitive. Well, if you must hear it, I don't know why you shouldn't. Maybe you ought to, anyhow, for you to kept writing me like a grieved parent when you heard I'd begun to cut the art club and keep away from Pickman. Now that he's disappeared, I go around to the club once in a while, but my nerves aren't what they were. Now I don't know what's become of Pickman, and I don't like to guess. You might have surmised I had some inside information when I dropped him, and that's why I don't want to think where he's gone. Let the police find what they can. It won't be much, judging from the fact that they don't know yet of the old North End place he hired under the name Peters. I'm not sure that I could find it again myself, not that I'd ever try, even in broad daylight. Yes, I do know, or I'm afraid I know, why he maintained it. I'm coming to that, and I think you'll understand before I'm through why I don't tell the police. They would ask me to guide them, and I couldn't go back there even if I knew the way. There was something there. And now I can't use the subway and you may as well have your laugh at this too, go down into my cellars anymore. I should think you'd have known I didn't drop Pickman for the same silly reasons that fussy old woman like Dr. Reed or Joe Minot or Bosworth did. Morbid art doesn't shock me, and when a man has the genius Pickman had, I feel it an honor to know him, no matter what direction his work takes him. Boston never had a greater painter than Richard Upton Pickman. I said it at first, and I say it still, and I've never swerved an inch either, when he showed that ghoul feeding that, you remember, was when Minot cut him. You know, it takes profound art and profound insight into nature to turn out stuff like Pickman's. Any magazine cover hack can splash paint around wildly and call it a nightmare, or a witch's sabbath, or a portrait of the devil. But only a great painter can make such a thing really scary or ring true. That's because only a real artist knows the actual anatomy of the terrible or the physiology of fear. The exact sort of lines and proportions that connect up with latent instincts or hereditary memories of fright, and the proper color contrasts and the lighting effects to stir the dormant sense of strangeness. I don't have to tell you why a Fuseli really brings a shiver while a cheap ghost story frontispiece merely makes us laugh. There's something those fellows catch beyond life that they're able to make us catch for a second. Dore had it. Sime has it. Engarola of Chicago has it. And Pickman had it as no man ever had it before, or, I hope to heaven, ever will again. Don't ask me what it is they see. You know, in ordinary art, there's all the difference in the world between the vital, breathing things drawn from nature or models, and the artificial truck that commercial small fry reel off in a bare studio by rule. Well, I should say that the really weird artist has a kind of vision which makes models or summons up what amounts to actual scenes from the spectral world he lives in. Anyhow, he manages to turn out results that differ from the pretender's mince pie dreams in just about the same way that the life painter's results differ from the concoctions of a correspondence school cartoonist. If I had ever seen what Pickman saw, but no. Here, let's have a drink before we get any deeper. God, I wouldn't be alive if I had ever seen what that man, if he was a man, saw. You recall that Pickman's forte was faces. I don't believe anybody since Goya could put so much of sheer hell into a set of features or a twist of expression. And before Goya, you have to go back to the medieval chaps who did the gargoyles and chimeras on Notre Dame and Mont Saint-Michel. They believed all sorts of things, and maybe they saw all sorts of things too, for the Middle Ages had some curious phrases. I remember your asking Pickman yourself once, the year before you went away, wherever in thunder he got such ideas and visions. Wasn't that a nasty laugh he gave you? It was partly because of that laugh that Reed dropped him. Reed, you know, had just taken up comparative pathology and was full of pompous inside stuff about the biological and evolutionary significance of this or that mental or physical symptom. He said Pickman repelled him more and more every day and almost frightened him toward the last. That the fellow's features and expression were slowly developing in a way he didn't like, in a way that wasn't human. He had a lot of talk about diet and said Pickman must be abnormal and eccentric to the last degree. I suppose you told Reed, if you and he had any correspondence over it, that he'd let Pickman's paintings get on his nerves or harrow up his imagination. I know I told him myself then. But keep in mind that I didn't drop Pickman for anything like this. On the contrary, my admiration for him kept growing. For that ghoul feeding was a tremendous achievement, as you know. The club wouldn't exhibit it, and the Museum of Fine Arts wouldn't accept it as a gift. I can add that nobody would buy it, so Pickman had it right in his house till he went. Now his father has it in Salem. You know, Pickman comes of old Salem stock, and had a witch ancestor hanged in 1692. I got into the habit of calling Pickman quite often, especially after I began making notes for a monograph on weird art. Probably it was his work which put the idea into my head, and anyway, I found him a mine of data and suggestions when I came to develop it. He showed me all the paintings and drawings he had about, including some pen and ink sketches that would, I verily believe, have gotten him kicked out of the club if many of the members had even seen them. Before long I was pretty nearly a devotee, and would listen for hours like a schoolboy to art theories and philosophical speculations, wild enough to qualify him for the Danvers Asylum. My hero worship, coupled with the fact that people generally were commencing to have less and less to do with him, made him very confidential with me. And one evening he hinted that if I were fairly closed-mouthed and none too squeamish, he might show me something rather unusual, something a bit stronger than anything he had in the house. You know, he said, there are things I won't do for Newberry Street. Things that are out of place here and can't be conceived here anyhow. It's my business to catch the overtones of the soul, and you won't find those in a parvenu set of artificial streets on made land. Back Bay isn't Boston. It isn't anything yet, because it's had no time to pick up memories and attract local spirits. If there are any ghosts here, they're the tame ghosts of Saltmarsh and a shallow cove, and I want human ghosts, the ghosts of beings highly organized enough to have looked on hell and known the meaning of what they saw. The place for an artist to live is the North End. If any aesthete were sincere, he'd put up with the slums for the sake of the mass traditions. God, man, don't you realize that places like that weren't merely made, but actually grew? Generation after generation lived and felt and died there, and in days when people weren't afraid to live and feel and die. Don't you know there was a mill on Copp's Hill in 1632, and that half the present streets were laid out by 1650? I can show you houses that have stood 2 centuries and a half more, houses that have witnessed what would make a modern house crumble into powder. What do moderns know of life and the force behind it? You call the Salem witchcraft a delusion, but I'll wage my 4 times great-grandmother could have told you things. They hanged her on Gallows Hill with Cotton Mather looking sanctimoniously on. Mather, damn him, was afraid somebody might succeed in kicking free of this accursed cage of monotony. I wish someone had laid a spell on him or sucked his blood in the night. I can show you a house he lived in. I can show you another one he was afraid to enter in spite of all his fine, bold talk. He knew things he didn't dare put into that stupid Magnalia or the puerile wonders of the invisible world. Look here, do you know the whole North End once had a set of tunnels that kept certain people in touch with each other's houses, and the burying ground and the sea? Let them prosecute and persecute above ground. Things went on every day that they couldn't reach. The voices laughed at night that they couldn't place. Why, man, out of 10 surviving houses built before 1700 and not moved since, I'll wager that in 8 I can show you something queer in the cellar. There's hardly a month that you don't read of workmen finding bricked up arches and wells leading nowhere in this or that old house as it comes down. You could see one near Henchman Street from the elevated last year. There were witches, and what their spells summoned, pirates, and what they brought in from the sea, smugglers, privateers, and I tell you, people knew how to live, and how to enlarge the bounds of life in the old times. This wasn't the only world a bold and wise man could know. Faugh! To think of today in contrast, with such pale pink brains that even a club of sponsored artists gets shudders and convulsions if a picture goes beyond the feelings of a Beacon Street tea table. The only saving grace of the present is that it's too damn stupid to question the past very closely. What do maps and records and guidebooks really tell of the North End? Bah! At a guess, I'll guarantee to lead you to 30 or 40 alleys and a network of alleys north of Prince Street that aren't suspected by 10 living beings outside of the foreigners that swarm them. And what do those, racial slur of Italians, know of their meaning? No, Thurber. These ancient places are dreaming gorgeously and overflowing with wonder and terror and escapes from the commonplace, and yet there's not a living soul to understand or profit by them, or rather there's only one living soul, for I haven't been digging around in the past for nothing. See here, you're interested in this sort of thing. What if I told you that I've got another studio up there? Or I can catch the night spirit of antique horror and paint things that I couldn't even think of in Newbury Street. Naturally, I don't tell these accursed old maids at the club, with Reed, damn him, whispering even as it is that I'm a sort of monster bound down the toboggan of reverse evolution. Yes, Thurber, I decided long ago that one must paint terror as well as beauty from life, so I did some exploring in places where I had reason to know terror lives. I've got a place that I don't believe 3 living Nordic men besides myself have ever seen. It isn't so very far from the elevated as distance goes, but it's centuries away as the soul goes. I took it from the queer old brick well because of the queer old brick well in the cellar. One of the sort I told you about. The shack's almost tumbling down so that nobody else would live there. And I'd hate to tell you how little I paid for it. The windows are boarded up, but I like that all the better. I don't want daylight for what I do. I paint in the cellar, where inspiration is thickest. But I've found other rooms furnished on the ground floor. A Sicilian owns it, and I've hired it under the name of Peters. Now, if you're game, I'll take you there tonight. I think you'd enjoy the pictures, for as I said, I've let myself go a bit there. It's no vast tour. I sometimes do it on foot, for I don't want to attract attention with a taxi in such a place. We can take the shuttle at the South Station for Battery Street, and after that the walk isn't much. Well, Elliot, there wasn't much for me to do after that harangue, but to keep myself from running instead of walking for the first vacant cab we could sight. We changed to the elevated at the South Station, and at about 12 o'clock had climbed down the steps at Battery Street and struck along the old waterfront past Constitution Wharf. I didn't keep track of the cross streets, and I can't tell you yet which it was we turned up. But I know it wasn't Greenough Lane. When we did turn, it was to climb through the deserted length of the oldest and dirtiest alley I've ever saw in my life, with crumbling-looking gables and broken small-pane windows and archaic chimneys that stood out half-disintegrated against the moonlit sky. I don't believe there were 3 houses in sight that hadn't been standing in Cotton Mather's time. Certainly I glimpsed at least 2 with an overhang, and once I thought I saw a peaked roof line of the almost forgotten pre-Gambrel type. though antiquarians tell us there are none left in Boston. From that alley, which had a dim light, we turned to the left into an equally silent and still narrower alley with no light at all, and in a minute made what I think was an obtuse, angled bend toward the right in the dark. Not long after this, Pickman produced a flashlight and revealed an antediluvian 10-paneled door that looked damnably worm-eaten. Unlocking it, he ushered me into a barren hallway with what was once splendid dark oak paneling, simply of course, but thrillingly suggestive of the times of Andros and Phipps and the witchcraft. Then he took me through a door on the left, lighted an oil lamp, and told me to make myself at home. Now, Elliot, I'm what the man on the street would call fairly hard-boiled. But I'll confess what I saw on the walls of that room gave me a bad turn. They were his pictures, you know, the ones he couldn't paint or even show in Newbury Street, and he was right when he said he had let himself go. Here, have another drink. I need one anyhow. There's no use in my trying to tell you what they were like, because the awful, the blasphemous horror, and the unbelievable loathsomeness and moral feuter came from simple touches, quite beyond the power of words to classify. I do like how Lovecraft always sidesteps describing anything. There was none of the exotic technique you see in Sidney Sim. None of the transcenturnian landscapes and lunar fungi that Clark Ashton Smith uses to freeze the blood. The backgrounds were mostly old churchyards, deep woods, cliffs by the sea, brick tunnels, ancient paneled rooms, or simple vaults of masonry. Copp's Hill burying ground, which could not be many blocks away from this very house, was a favorite scene. The madness and monstrosity lay in the figures in the foreground, for Pickman's morbid art was preeminently one of demonic portraiture. These figures were seldom completely human, but often approached humanity in varying degree. Most of the bodies, while roughly bipedal, had forward slumping and vaguely canine cast. The texture of the majority was kind of unpleasant rubberiness. Ugh! I can see them now. Their occupations, well, don't ask me to be too precise. They were usually feeding. I won't say on what. They were sometimes shown in groups in cemeteries or underground passages, and often appeared to be in battle over their prey, or rather their treasure trove. And what damnable expressiveness Pickman sometimes gave the sightless faces of this carnal booty. Occasionally, the things were shown leaping through open windows at night, or squatting on the chests of sleepers, worrying at their throats. One canvas showed a ring of them baying about a hanged witch on Gallows Hill, whose dead face held a close kinship to theirs. But don't get the idea that it was all this hideous business of theme and setting which struck me faint. I'm not a 3-year-old kid, and I'd seen much like this before. It was the faces, Elliot, those accursed faces that leered and slavered out of the canvas with the very breath of life. By God, man, I verily believe they were alive. That nauseous wizard had waked the fires of hell in pigment, and his brush had been a nightmare-spawning wand. Give me that decanter, Elliot. I don't think I mentioned before, but exactly what I like about Lovecraft is the melodramatic, unintentional comedy of it at times. There was one thing called the lesson. Heaven pity me that I ever sought. Listen, can you fancy a squatting circle of nameless dog-like things in a churchyard, teaching a small child how to feed like themselves? The price of a changeling, I suppose. You know the old myth about how the weird people leave their spawn in cradles in exchange for the human babes they steal? Pickman was showing what happens to those stolen babes, how they grow up. And then I began to see a hideous relationship in the faces of the human and non-human figures. He was in all his gradations of morbidity between the frankly non-human and degradedly human, establishing a sardonic linkage in evolution. The dog things were developed from mortals. And no sooner had I wondered what he made of their own young as left with mankind in the form of changelings, than my eye caught a picture embodying that very thought. It was of an ancient Puritan interior, a heavily beamed room with latticed windows, a settle, and clumsy 17th century furniture, with the family sitting about while the father read from the scriptures. Every face but one showed nobility and reverence, but that one reflected the mockery of the pit. It was that of a young man in years, and no doubt belonged to a supposed son of that pious father, but in essence it was the kin of unclean things. It was their changeling, and in spirit of supreme ironies, Pickman had given the features of a very perceptible resemblance to his own. By this time, Pickman had lighted a lamp in an adjoining room and was politely holding open the door for me. He asked me if I would care to see his modern studies. I hadn't been able to give him much of my opinions. I was too speechless with fright and loathing. But I think he fully understood and felt highly complimented. And now I want to assure you again, Elliot, that I'm no mollycoddle to scream at anything which shows a bit of departure from the usual. I'm a middle-aged and decently sophisticated, and I guess you saw enough of me in France to know that I'm not easily knocked out. Remember, too, that I just about recovered my wind and gotten used to those frightful pictures which turned colonial New England into a kind of annex of hell. Well, in spite of all this, the next room forced a real scream out of me, and I had to clutch at the doorway to keep from keeling over. The other chamber had shown a pack of ghouls and witches overrunning the world of our forefathers, but this one brought the horror right into our own daily life. God, how that man could paint! There was a study called Subway Accident, in which a flock of the vile things were clambering up from some unknown catacomb through a crack in the floor of the Boylston Street subway and attacking a crowd of people on the platform. Another showed a dance on Copp's Hill among the tombs with the background of today. Then there were any number of cellar views with monsters creeping in through holes and rifts in the masonry, grinning as they squatted behind barrels or furnaces and waited for their first victim to descend the stairs. One disgusting canvas seemed to depict the vast cross-section of Beacon Hill, with ant-like armies of mephitic monsters squeezing themselves through burrows that honeycombed the ground. Dances in the modern cemeteries were freely pictured, and another conception somehow shocked me more than all the rest. A scene in an unknown vault, where scores of the beasts crowded about one who held a well-known Boston guidebook and was evidently reading aloud. All were pointing to a certain passage, and every face seemed so distorted with epileptic and reverberant laughter that I almost thought I heard the fiendish echoes. And the title of the picture was Holmes, Lowell, and Longfellow Lie Buried in Mount Auburn. As I gradually steadied myself and got readjusted to this second room of deviltry and morbidity, I began to analyze some of the points in my second sickening loathing. In the first place, I said to myself, these things repelled because of the utter inhumanity and callous cruelty they showed in Pickman. The fellow must be a relentless enemy of all mankind to take such glee in the torture of brain and flesh and the degradation of the moral tenement. In the second place, they terrified because of their very greatness. Their art was the art of that convinced. When we saw the pictures, we saw the demons themselves and were afraid of them. And the queer part was that Pickman got none of this power from the use of selectiveness or bizarrerie. Nothing was blurred, distorted, or conventionalized. Outlines were sharp and lifelike. Details were almost painfully defined, and the faces. It was not any mere artist's interpretation that we saw. It was pandemonium itself, crystal clear in stark objectivity. That was it, by heaven. The man was not a fantast, or a romanticist at all. He did not even try to give us the churning, prismatic ephemera of dreams, but coldly and sardonically reflected some stable, mechanistic, well-established horror world, which he saw fully, brilliantly, and squarely, and unfalteringly. God knows what world can have been, or where he ever glimpsed the blasphemous shapes that loped and trotted and crawled through it. But whatever the baffling source of his images, one thing was plain: Pickman was in every sense, in conception and in execution, a thorough and painstaking and almost scientific realist. GS says, these descriptions must have inspired many paintings so vivid. Yes, they have, actually, if you look up Pickman's paintings, you can find artist conceptions of them. My host was now leading the way down cellar to his actual studio, and I braced myself for some hellish effects among the unfinished canvases. As we reached the bottom of the damp stairs, he turned his flashlight to a corner of the large open space at hand, revealing the circular brick curb of what was evidently a great well in the earthen floor. We walked nearer, and I saw that it must be 5 feet across, with walls a good foot thick and some 6 inches above the ground level. Solid work of the 17th century, or I was much mistaken. That, Pickman said, was the kind of thing he'd been talking about, an aperture of the networks of tunnels that used to undermine the hill. I noticed idly that it did not seem to be bricked up, that a heavy disc of wood formed the apparent cover. Thinking of the things this well must have been connected with, if Pickman's wild hints had not been mere rhetoric, I shivered slightly, then turned to follow him up a step and through a narrow door into a room of fair size, provided with a wooden floor and furnished as a studio. An acetylene gas outfit gave the light necessary for work. The unfinished pictures on easels or propped against walls were as ghastly as the finished ones upstairs, and showed the painstaking methods of the artist. Scenes were blocked out with extreme care, and penciled guidelines told of the minute exactitude which Pickman used in getting the right perspective and proportions. The man was great. I say it even now, knowing as much as I do. A large camera on a table excited my notice, and Pickman told me that he used it in taking scenes for the backgrounds, so that he might paint them from photographs in the studio, instead of carting his outfit around the town for this or that view. He thought a photograph quite as good as an actual scene or model for sustained work, and declared he employed them regularly. There was something very disturbing about the nauseous sketches and half-finished monstrosities that leered around from every side of the room, and when Pickman suddenly unveiled a huge canvas on the side away from the light, I could not for my life keep back a loud scream. The second I admitted that night, it echoed and echoed through the dim vaultings of that ancient and nitrous cellar, and I had to choke back a flood of reaction that threatened to burst out as hysterical laughter. Merciful Creator, Eliot, but I don't know how much was real and how much was feverish fancy. It doesn't seem to me that Earth can hold a dream like that. It was a colossal and nameless blasphemy with glaring red eyes, and it held in bony claws a thing that had been a man, gnawing at the head as a child nibbles at a stick of candy. Its position was a kind of crouch, and as one looked, one felt that at any moment it might drop its present prey and seek a juicier morsel. But damn it all, it wasn't even the fiendish subject that made it such an immortal fountainhead of all panic. Not that, nor the dog face with its pointed ears and bloodshot eyes, flat nose, drooling lips. It wasn't the scaly claws, nor the mold-caked body, nor the half-hooved feet. None of these, though any one of them might have well driven an excitable man to madness. It was the technique, Eliot, the cursed, the impious, the unnatural technique. As I am a living being, I never elsewhere saw the actual breath of life so fused into a canvas. The monster was there. It glared and gnawed and gnawed and gnawed and glared. And I knew that only a suspension of nature's law could ever let a man paint a thing like that without a model, without some glimpse of the netherworld which no mortal unsold to the fiend has ever had. Pinned with a thumbtack to a vacant part of the canvas was a piece of paper now badly curled up. Probably, I thought, a photograph from which Pickman meant to paint a background as hideous as the nightmare it was to enhance. I reached out to uncurl it and look at it when suddenly I saw Pickman start as if shot. He'd been listening with peculiar intensity ever since my shocked scream had waked unaccustomed echoes in the dark cellar, and now he seemed struck with fright, which, though not comparable to my own, had in it more of the physical than the spiritual. He drew a revolver and motioned me to silence, then stepped out into the main cellar and closed the door behind him. I think I was paralyzed for an instant. Imitating Pickman's listening, I fancied I heard a faint scurrying sound somewhere, and a series of squeals or bleats in a direction I couldn't determine. I thought of huge rats and shuddered. Then there came a subdued sort of clatter which somehow set me all in goose flesh. A furtive, groping kind of clatter, though I can't attempt to convey what I mean in words. It was like heavy wood falling on stone or wood on brick. What did that make me think of? It came again and louder. There was a vibration as if the wood had fallen further than it had fallen before. After that followed a sharp grating noise, a shouted gibberish from Pickman, and the deafening discharge of all 6 chambers of a revolver, fired spectacularly as a lion tamer might fire in the air for effect. A muffled squeal or squawk and a thud. Then more wood and brick grating, a pause, and the opening of the door, at which I'll confess I started violently. Pickman reappeared with his smoking weapon, cursing the bloated rats that infested the ancient well. "The deuce knows what they eat, Thurber," he grinned. "For those archaic tunnels touched graveyard and witch den and east sea coast. But whatever it is, they must have run short, for they were devilish anxious to get out. Your yelling stirred them up, I fancy. Better be cautious in these old places. Our rodent friends are the one drawback, though I sometimes think they're a positive asset by way of atmosphere and color." Well, Eliot, that was the end of the night's adventure. Pickman had promised to show me the place, and heaven knows he'd done it. He led me out of the tangle of alleys in another direction, it seems, for when we sighted a lamp post, we were in a half-familiar street with monotonous rows of mingled tenement blocks and old houses. Charter Street it turned out to be, but I was too flustered to notice just where we hit it. We were too late for the elevated and walked back downtown through Hanover Street. I remember that walk. We switched from Tremont up Beacon, and Pickman left me at the corner of Joy where I turned off. I never spoke to him again. Why did I drop him? Don't be impatient. Wait till I ring for coffee. We've had enough of the other stuff, but I for one need something. No, it wasn't the paintings I saw in that place, though I'll swear they were enough to get him ostracized in 9/10 of the homes and clubs of Boston, and I guess you won't wonder why I have to steer clear of subways and cellars. It was something I found in my coat the next morning. You know, the curled-up paper tacked to that frightful canvas in the cellar. The thing that I thought it was a photograph of some scene he meant to use as a background for that monster. That last scare had come while I was reaching to uncurl it, and it seems I had vacantly crumpled it into my pocket. But here's the coffee. Take it black, Elliot, if you're wise. Yes, that paper was the reason I dropped Pickman. Richard Upton Pickman, the greatest artist I've ever known, and the foulest being that ever leaped the bounds of life into the pits of myth and madness. Elliot, old Reed was right. He wasn't strictly human. Either he was born in strange shadow, or he'd found a way to unlock the forbidden gate. It's all the same now, for he's gone back into the fabulous darkness he loved to haunt. Here, let's have the chandelier going. Don't ask me to explain or even conjecture about what I burned. Don't ask me either what lay behind that mole-like scrambling Pickman was so keen to pass off as rats. There are secrets, you know, which might have come down from old Salem times, and Cotton Mather tells even stranger things. You know how damned lifeline-like Pickman's paintings were, how we all wondered where he got those faces. Well, that paper wasn't a photograph of any background after all. What it showed was simply the monstrous being he was painting on that awful canvas. It was the model he was using, and its background was merely the wall of the cellar studio in minute detail. But by God, Elliot, it was a photograph from life. GS says, what a vivid imagination. Also says, squatting on the chest of sleepers is pretty creepy. Yeah, there's actually a whole Asian mythos, folklore around things that sit on your chest in your sleep and paralyze you. So what do we pull from Lovecraft before we wrap up with our short little Mark Twain story? What we can pull from Lovecraft is, you know, if Poe is good at ambiance and themes and stuff, like he really sort of ropes you in. And if H.G. Wells is very good at weaving mythic tales out of imagined worlds, and Conan Doyle is really good with dialogue, what he's good at, Lovecraft, is that sense of a bigger world. And I think in all the other people that we read, with the exception of Wells, of course, there was always this sense that it's just Victorian out there. It's you know, whatever world you currently live in. And he was the first one to do a little bit of that, but then say, like, here is an interconnected mythos. In Dagon, the first one we read, we saw the beginnings, this first instance of like a Cthulhu type mythos. And Dagon comes up and is referenced in Call of Cthulhu. And Dagon as a god comes up in some of his mythos later too. And so it's just a matter of, like, he eventually interconnected his world. The second thing we see, though, is this sort of onset of madness and the hybrid creatures of darkness and doom, and dabbling into unknown darkness that drives you mad and distorts you permanently, and suicide over that madness, and drug use and stuff. That all those which are kind of tropes, I guess now, that's all comes from Lovecraft. So that was sort of his contribution. And I've said quite a bit about him, so I won't blabble on too much. Which means it's time for legendary humorist and satirist Mark Twain. And I think I won't say much more on this. I think you'll understand why I chose to read this story when I have finished it. This is called A Ghost Story by Mark Twain. That's just a picture of the original page. I took a large room far up Broadway in a huge old building whose upper stories had been wholly unoccupied for years until I came. The place had long been given up to dust and cobwebs, to solitude and silence. I seemed groping among the tombs and invading the privacy of the dead that first night I climbed up to my quarters. For the first time in my life, a superstitious dread came over me, and as I turned a dark angle of the stairway, An invisible cobweb swung its lazy woof in my face and clung there, and I shuddered as one who had encountered a phantom. I was glad enough when I reached my room and locked out the mold in the darkness. A cheery fire was burning in the grate, and I sat down before it with a comforting sense of relief. For 2 hours I sat there, thinking of bygone times, recalling old scenes, summoning half-forgotten faces out of the mists of the past, listening, in fancy, to voices that long ago grew silent for all time, and to once familiar songs that nobody sings now. And as my reverie softened down to a sadder and sadder pathos, the shrieking of the winds outside softened to a wail. The angry beating of the rain against the panes diminished to a tranquil patter, and one by one the noises in the street subsided until the hurrying footsteps of the last belated straggler died away in the distance and left no sound behind. The fire had burned low. A sense of loneliness crept over me. I arose and undressed, moving on tiptoe about the room, doing stealthily what I had to do, as if I were environed by sleeping enemies whose slumbers it would be fatal to break. I covered up in bed and lay listening to the rain and wind and the faint creaking of distant shutters till they lulled me to sleep. I slept profoundly, but how long I do not know. All at once I found myself awake and filled with shuddering expectancy. All was still. All but my own heart. I could hear it beat. Presently the bedclothes began to slip away slowly toward the foot of the bed, as if someone were pulling them. I could not stir. I could not speak. Still the blankets slipped deliberately away till my breast was uncovered. Then with a great effort I seized them and drew them back over my head. I waited, listened, and waited. Once more that steady pull began, and once more I lay torpid, a century of dragging seconds, till my breast was naked again. At last I roused my energies and snatched my covers back to their place, and held them with a strong grip. I waited. By and by I felt a faint tug, took a fresh grip. The tug strengthened to a steady strain. It grew stronger and stronger. My hold parted, and for the third time the blanket slid away. I groaned. An answering groan came from the foot of the bed. Beaded drops of sweat stood upon my forehead. I was more dead than alive. Presently I heard a very heavy footstep in my room. The step of an elephant, it seemed to me. It was not like anything human, but it was moving from me. There was relief in that. I heard it approach the door, pass out without moving the bolt or lock, and wander away among the dismal corridors, straining the floors and joists till they creaked again as it passed, and then silence reigned once more. When my excitement had calmed, I said to myself, "This is a dream. This is simply a hideous dream," and so I lay thinking it over until I convinced myself that it was a dream. And then a comforting laugh relaxed from my lips, and I was happy again. I got up and struck a light, and when I found that the locks and bolts were just as I had left them, another soothing laugh welled up in my heart and rippled from my lips. I took my pipe and lit it, and was just sitting down before the fire when down went the pipe out of my nervous fingers. The blood forsook my cheeks, and my placid breathing was cut short with a gasp. In the ashes of the hearth, side by side with my own bare footprint, was another, so vast in comparison, mine was but an infant's. Then I had a visitor, and the elephant tread was explained. I put out the light and returned to bed, palsied with fear. I lay a long time peering into the darkness and listening. Then I heard a grating noise overhead like the dragging of a heavy body across the floor. Then the throwing down of the body and the shaking of my windows in response to the concussion. In distant parts of the building I heard the muffled slamming of doors. I heard at intervals stealthy footsteps creeping in out among the corridors and up and down the stairs. Sometimes these noises approached my door, hesitated, and went away again. I heard the clanking of chains faintly in remote passages, and listened while the clanking grew nearer. While it warily climbed the stairways, marking each move by the loose surplus of chains that fell with an accented rattle upon each succeeding step as the goblin that bore it advanced. I heard muttered sentences, half-uttered screams that seemed smothered violently, and the swish of invisible garments, the rush of invisible wings. Then I became conscious that my chamber was invaded, that I was not alone. I heard sighs and breathings about my bed, and mysterious whisperings. 3 little spheres of soft phosphorescent light appeared on the ceiling directly over my head, clung and glowed there for a moment, and then dropped. 2 of them upon my face and 1 upon the pillow. They spattered liquidly and felt warm. Intuition told me that they had turned to gouts of blood as they fell. I needed no light to satisfy myself that. Then I saw pallid faces, dimly luminous, and white uplifted hands floating bodiless in the air, floating a moment and then disappearing. The whispering ceased, and the voices and the sounds and a solemn stillness followed. I waited and listened. I felt that I must have light or die. I was weak with fear. I slowly raised myself toward a sitting posture, and my face came in contact with a clammy hand. All strength went from me apparently, and I fell back like a stricken invalid. Then I heard the rustle of a garment. It seemed to pass to the door and go out. When everything was still once more, I crept out of bed, sick and feeble, and lit the gas with a hand that trembled as if it were aged with 100 years. The light brought some cheer to my spirits. I sat down and fell into a dreamy contemplation of that great footprint in the ashes. By and by its outlines began to waver and grow dim. I glanced up, and the broad gas flame was slowly wilting away. In the same moment I heard the elephantine tread again. I noted its approach, nearer and nearer along the musty halls, and dimmer the light waned. The tread reached my very door and paused. The light had dwindled to a sickly blue, and all things about me lay in a spectral twilight. The door did not open, and yet I felt a faint gust of air fan my cheek, and presently was conscious of a huge, cloudy presence before me. I watched it with fascinated eyes. A pale glow stole over the thing. Gradually its cloudy folds took shape. An arm appeared, then legs, then a body, and at last a great sad face looked out of the paper. Stripped of its filmy housings, naked, muscular, and comely, the majestic Cardiff giant loomed above me. All my misery vanished, for a child might know that no harm could come with that benignant countenance. Benignant? Never actually seen that iteration of benignant countenance. I mean, I've read it, I just didn't notice it. My cheerful spirits returned at once, and in sympathy with them the gas flame up brightly again. Never a lonely outcast was so glad to welcome company as I was to greet the friendly giant. I said, "Why is it nobody but you? Why is it nobody but you? Do you know I've been scared to death for the last 2 or 3 hours? I am honestly just glad to see you. I wish I had a chair. Here, don't try to sit down in that thing." But it was too late. He was in it before I could stop him, and down he went. Never saw a chair shivered so in my life. Stop, you'll ruin Too late again. There was another crash, and another chair was resolved into its original elements. Confound it. Haven't you got any judgment at all? Do you want to ruin all the furniture on the place? Here, you petrified fool. But it was no use. Before I could arrest him, he sat down on the bed, and it was a melancholy ruin. Now, what sort of way is that to do? First you come lumbering about the place, bringing a legion of vagabond goblins with you to worry me to death. And then when I overlook an indelicacy of costume, which would not be tolerated anywhere by cultivated people, except in a respectable theater, and not even there if the nudity were of your sex, you repay me by wrecking all the furniture you can sit down on. And why will you? You damage yourself as much as you do me. You've broken off the end of your spinal column, littered up the floor with chips of your hams, till the place looked like a marble yard. You ought to be ashamed of yourself. You're big enough to know better. Well,
I will not break any more furniture, but what am I to do? I have not had a chance to sit down for a century, and the tears came into his eyes.
Poor devil, I said. Should not have been so harsh with you. And you're an orphan too, no doubt, but sit down on the floor here. Nothing else can stand your weight. And besides, we cannot be sociable with you way up there above me. I want you down where I can perch on this high counting stool and gossip with you face to face. And there's a picture of it. So he sat down on the floor and lit a pipe, which I gave him, threw one of my red blankets over his shoulders, inverted my sitz bath on his head, helmet fashion, and made himself picturesque and comfortable. Then he crossed his ankles while I renewed the fire and exposed the flat, honeycombed bottoms of his prodigious feet to the grateful warmth. What is the matter with your feet on the back of your legs? Why are they all gouged up so? Infernal chilblains. I caught them clear up to the back of my head, roosting out there under Newell's farm. But I love the place. I love it as one loves his old home. There is no peace for me like the peace I feel when I'm there. We talked along for a half an hour, and then I noticed he looked tired and spoke of it. Tired, he said. Well, I should think so, and now I'll tell you all about it, since you've treated me so well. I am the spirit of the petrified man that lies across the street there in the museum. I am the ghost of the Cardiff giant. I can have no rest, no peace, till they've given the poor body a burial again. Now what was the most natural thing for me to do to make men satisfy this wish? Terrify them into it. Haunt the place where the body lay. So I haunted the museum night after night. I even got other spirits to help me, but it did no good, for nobody ever came in the museum at midnight. Then it occurred to me to come over the way and haunt this place a little. I felt that if I ever got a hearing I must succeed, for I had the most efficient company that perdition could furnish. Night after night we've shivered along these mildewed halls, dragging chains, groaning, whispering, tramping up and down the stairs, till, to tell you the truth, I'm almost worn out. But when I saw a light to your room tonight, it roused my energies again, and I went at it with a deal of the old freshness. But I am tired out, entirely fagged out. Give me, I beseech you, give me some hope. I lit off my perch in a burst of excitement and exclaimed, This transcends everything. Everything that ever did occur. Why, you poor blundering old fossil, you have all your trouble for nothing. You've been haunting a plaster cast of yourself. The real Cardiff giant is in Albany. A fact, this is a note from him, a fact the original fraud was ingeniously and fraudfully duplicated and exhibited in New York as the only genuine Cardiff giant, to the unspeakable disgust of the owners of the real Colossus at the very same time that the latter was drawing crowds at the museum in Albany. Confound it, don't you know your own remains? I never saw such an eloquent look of shame, of pitiable humiliation, overspread a countenance before. The petrified man slowly rose to his feet and said, Honestly, is that true? As true as I am sitting here. He took the pipe from his mouth and laid it on the mantel, then stood irresolute for a moment, unconsciously from old habit, thrusting his hands where his pantaloon pockets should have been, and meditatively dropping his chin on his breast, and finally said, Well, I've never felt so absurd before. The petrified man has sold everybody else, and now the mean fraud is ended by selling its own ghost? My son, if there is any charity left in your heart for a poor friendless phantom like me, don't let this get out. I think how you'd feel if you made such an ass of yourself. I heard this stately tramp die away, step by step down the stairs and out into the deserted street, and felt sorry that he was gone, poor fellow, and sorrier still that he carried off my red blanket and my bathtub. All right. Well, we went a little long tonight, and I appreciate you for sticking it out, but I really wanted to tell that story, and I realized that it kind of upturns the point of horror and haunted stories, so I decided to push it in at the end here, as I knew only the most committed would stick around for it. So for that reason, I won't drag out the ending too much. GS says, oh, she loves the giant voice. Well, thank you. I'm sure it wasn't that consistent. I have a challenge keeping things consistent sometimes. And thank you so much for everybody who's been tuning in all month for our horror stories. I've had a lot of fun reading them. Next month, we'll be looking more towards folktales and fairy tales again. And obviously, there's another season coming up, and we'll be trying to find some stuff to do with myths around that season. But I've been sort of forbidden to mention it until like the second week of November or something, even though it is by far one of my favorite seasons, if not the. But for the rest, thank you very much. And, well, you take care of yourself out there. Oh, and by the way, this week, on Thursday, we're doing a really fun thing that's connected to stuff we've done this month. But on Sunday, I'm going to have a special release of a story that I'll say a bit more about on Thursday, actually. And I think you guys will really enjoy it. Thank you so much, and have a good sleep if you can.